Okay, welcome to a new deep dive. Today, we are jumping headfirst into a specific, but actually incredibly practical academic skill, writing a review article.
Yeah, it's something a lot of people grapple with.
Totally. If you've ever felt, just overwhelmed by the sheer volume of research out there and wondered how anyone makes sense of it all, or maybe you're looking to contribute your own synthesis to a field, well, this is definitely for you.
Absolutely. And review articles are just so crucial for navigating the academic landscape. They aren't just summaries, not really.
Right.
They are how experts synthesize vast amounts of info, identify trends, point out gaps. Essentially, they shape the ongoing conversations within a discipline. They're interpretive works, fundamentally.
And figuring out where to even begin that process can feel like, well, standing at the base of a mountain, can't it?
It really can.
Luckily, we found this great guide that lays out a clear path. We're pulling today from the Academic Practices account on Instagram. They put together a really useful step-by-step overview.
Yes, I saw that. Their guide frames writing a review article, not just as like an assignment, but as a genuine contribution to academia.
Exactly.
It's about taking existing knowledge, interpreting it critically, and, engaging with the key debates.
Precisely. So our goal in this deep dive is to use that guide as our roadmap. We'll walk through each step, Academic Practices outlines, unpacking the why and the how behind their advice.
Mm-hmm.
Think of this as your shortcut, maybe. Not just to what the steps are, but to understanding the process well enough to, well, actually start writing.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this guide from Academic Practices and dive in.
Let's do it. Let's open it up.
Okay, so the guide kicks off with this foundational question. It seems simple, but it's probably the most critical first step.
Oh, yeah?
What gap in the field do you aim to fill?
Ah, yes. This really is where everything starts, isn't it? It's easy to pick a topic you find interesting, sure. But a valuable review article isn't just about personal interest. You have to identify a genuine need in the existing literature. What hasn't been synthesized recently? What debate needs clarifying? Are there new findings that challenge old assumptions? Things like that.
And that requires some pretty deep reading first, right? You can't know the gap until you actually know the landscape.
Exactly.
Academic Practices really emphasizes defining the boundaries, too, like what specific area are you covering? Are you looking at a specific methodology, maybe, or a particular population, a certain time period?
Precisely. Defining those boundaries is, well, it's non-negotiable. It dictates which sources you'll even consider. Without clear boundaries, you just risk getting completely lost.
Yeah, drowning in papers.
Right, and that question of relevance and contribution, are you absolutely sure your proposed review is truly needed right now? It forces you to think critically right from the start. So this raises an important question for you, the listener. How do you move from just a broad area of interest to identifying that specific addressable gap that your review can meaningfully fill?
That's the challenge.
It involves a kind of detective work, really, sifting through what exists to see what's missing or maybe what needs a fresh look.
It absolutely is detective work. And it's often iterative, I find. You think you see a gap, you start searching, and maybe you find a review article from last year that almost covers it.
Right. Happens all the time.
So you have to narrow it down or shift your focus slightly. It's definitely a dynamic process.
It is. And okay, so once you have a better sense of that gap and its boundaries, Academic Practices takes us to the next crucial decision point.
Which is?
Figuring out what type of review you actually need to write. Because the approach you take fundamentally changes based on your objective.
Ah, yes. This part from the guide was really illuminating for me.
Yeah.
I think, many people might just think review article is just one thing.
A monolith.
But there are so many distinct strategies, and each serves a really different purpose.
Yeah, they list several common types, and understanding the distinctions is absolutely key to choosing the right tool for your specific gap. You've got the systematic review, the narrative review, critical review, mapping review, scoping review, umbrella review, and meta-analysis. Quite a list.
Okay, let's try and briefly break down what Academic Practices says about the core idea behind a few of these, because the differences really do matter in practice. A systematic review, for example, that sounds incredibly rigorous.
It is.
The guide describes it as impartial, systematic, focused on answering a specific research question by examining published studies.
Right. It's designed to minimize bias as much as possible. You establish a really strict protocol for searching and selecting studies before you even start. The goal is exhaustive coverage on a narrow question.
Like blueprints for a building, you said earlier.
Exactly. Think of it like building a structure according to very precise blueprints. It's fantastic for answering well-defined questions, especially with quantitative data. Often involves data extraction, maybe some analysis from individual studies.
Okay, rigorous and specific. Got it.
Yeah.
How about the narrative review then? The guide calls that a more general evaluation and critical synthesis. Sounds a bit more flexible.
It often is, yeah. A narrative review is usually broader in scope than a systematic review. Here, the author synthesizes literature to give an overview of a topic, maybe discuss different perspectives or trace historical developments.
So less rigid.
Well, while it's still critical and synthetic, it relies more on the author's expertise and perspective to select and interpret the literature. It's not based on that rigid, predefined protocol aiming for exhaustive inclusion like the systematic one. It's more like weaving together different threads based on your expert judgment.
Okay, that contrast is helpful. Rigorous protocol versus expert-driven synthesis. What about the critical review? That name itself suggests a different level of engagement.
It does.
Academic Practices describes it as critically assessing literature quality and going beyond explanation to include analysis and conceptual innovation, often resulting in a hypothesis or model.
Whoa! Yes, the critical review is where you're not just summarizing or synthesizing, you're actively evaluating the literature's strengths and weaknesses. You might be identifying theoretical shortcomings or proposing new ways of thinking about the topic.
So really pushing things.
Exactly. You might be critiquing methodologies, challenging dominant paradigms, or using existing work to build a new theoretical framework or even generate a novel hypothesis. It's highly analytical and often more argumentative, more perspective-driven than a standard narrative review.
Wow. So you're genuinely aiming to push the field forward, not just consolidate what's there.
That's the idea.
And the other types mentioned in the guide, they seem more focused on, like, mapping or assessment. Mapping reviews use visualization, scoping reviews do a preliminary assessment of evidence, and umbrella reviews compile other reviews. Sounds very meta.
Precisely. And a meta-analysis specifically uses statistical techniques to combine results from multiple quantitative studies to get an overall finding. That's usually done within a systematic review framework. But what's fascinating here, and really important, is how choosing the right type of review is probably the second most critical decision after nailing down your gap.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because the type you pick dictates everything that follows. Your search strategy, how you handle the data or the information, the structure of your writing, and ultimately the kind of contribution you can claim to make.
So different tools for different jobs.
Exactly. Each serves a very different purpose in the academic ecosystem. You wouldn't use a narrative review if your goal was to definitively prove the efficacy of an intervention based on all available trials. That really calls for a systematic review and potentially a meta-analysis.
That makes so much sense. Your objective must align with the review type you choose. Okay, so once you know what kind of review you're writing, that brings us to the source material itself. Academic Practices talks about carefully selecting your sources.
Right. And the core advice here is pretty straightforward on the surface. Use reliable and up-to-date materials, articles, books, reports. Pretty standard.
And crucially, they say, actively utilize academic databases like Web of Science and Scopus.
Yes, those are key.
These databases are just essential, aren't they? They index high-quality, peer-reviewed journals. They provide powerful search tools, citation tracking. They're the gateway, really.
They are the gateway, but as Academic Practices wisely points out, it's not only about the newest, most recent papers you find in a keyword search.
Oh, what else?
They say you need to be careful not to miss critical studies that chronologically reflect the historical trajectory of the topic, and, just as important, do not overlook highly cited works.
That's a really key nuance. You can't understand the current state of a field without understanding how it actually got there.
Exactly right.
Skipping those foundational papers or seminal works would just leave a massive hole in your synthesis.
A huge hole. It's about building a complete picture. So when you're searching, it's not just about plugging keywords into a database and taking the top hits.
Right.
You need to think about citation chaining, looking at who cited those key historical papers and maybe who those papers cited. It's a blend of systematic searching for recent work and some strategic digging for the foundational and influential studies. This raises another important question for you, the listener, especially when you might be faced with hundreds or even thousands of potential sources.
Yeah, that's daunting.
How do you develop a search strategy that effectively balances capturing the latest cutting-edge research with including that essential historical context and those highly cited foundational studies? How do you ensure you don't miss the critical pieces?
It definitely requires a strategic approach, doesn't it? And probably some trial and error with search terms and methods.
Absolutely.
Okay, so once you've wrestled with finding and selecting your sources, which is, let's be honest, a huge task in itself, the guide moves on to establishing the structure. This is where you start organizing that mountain of material into something coherent.
Yeah, bringing order to the chaos. The guide outlines the standard essential components: introduction, literature review section, discussion, and conclusion.
Pretty standard academic structure.
It is, and this structure is a convention for a really good reason. It provides a logical flow that helps the reader follow your synthesis and your argument.
And for each part, Academic Practices gives its specific purpose. The introduction, that's where you set the stage, right? Emphasize the importance, clearly state the scope, lay out the aim of your review.
Yep. What question are you addressing? Why is it important now? You're essentially making the case for why this review even exists and what territory it covers.
Got it. Then comes the core, the literature review section itself. This is where you present the current state of the field as you found it in your sources, highlighting the main findings, themes, maybe the big debates.
Exactly. This is where you synthesize all that reading. But then, crucially, there's the discussion section, which is distinct. The source says here, you analyze the existing information through a critical lens.
So you're not just reporting anymore.
Not at all. This is where your interpretation really comes to the forefront. You're bringing together the different findings from the literature review section, comparing them, contrasting them, maybe identifying patterns or contradictions, and offering your critical assessment.
So asking, what does this all mean?
Pretty much. What does this body of literature as a whole tell us? What are its limitations? Where are the interesting tensions?
Got it. So, literature review section presents the material, discussion interprets and critiques it, and finally, the conclusion. That provides a general evaluation based on your analysis and offers recommendations for future research.
Right. It wraps everything up, reiterates the main takeaways, maybe reinforces the significance of your findings, and points the way forward for other researchers.
That structure makes sense.
It's key because it doesn't just organize the information, it organizes your argument. It helps you build a case for your synthesis and guide the reader logically from understanding the landscape to grasping your critical interpretation and seeing what comes next.
Like that house analogy you used, the structure provides the essential framework.
Exactly. It holds everything together and makes it navigable.
That's a great way to put it. It's not just putting pieces next to each other. It's building something solid. And speaking of building, Academic Practices then really stresses the craft of writing itself. It's about writing critically and coherently.
Yes, this is where the real deep dive aspect of writing a review article truly comes to life. The source makes it really clear that a review article should involve not only summarization, but also interpretation and synthesis.
Yeah, not just book reports.
Definitely not. You're not just describing studies one by one. That's an annotated bibliography, not a review article.
Right, you're connecting them. The guide says you must offer new perspectives by linking different studies. This is where your unique contribution really starts to shine through, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You're finding the relationships, the common threads, maybe the divergences, the unanswered questions that emerge when you look across a body of work, not just within individual papers.
That's it, exactly. You're seeing the forest, not just the individual trees, and pointing out features of that forest that others might have missed.
Oh, nice.
You might link, say, a finding from Study A back in 2010 with a finding from Study B in 2020 and argue that, combined, they suggest a new theoretical possibility, even if neither study mentioned the other. That's synthesis.
Okay, that's the creative part.
It is. And the ultimate goal, as Academic Practices puts it, is that readers of your work should both understand the topic and be able to infer how they can use the content.
That's powerful. You're not just informing them, you're actually equipping them.
Precisely.
You're providing a synthesized understanding that they can then take and apply to their own research, their practice, maybe just their thinking. Knowledge is most valuable when it's understood and applied, right?
Couldn't agree more. And a great review article really facilitates that application. Your critical analysis and coherent writing make that possible.
Okay, and finally, the guide wraps up with those absolutely essential steps for polishing your work before it goes out into the world.
The home stretch.
Reading your work multiple times yourself, and just as important, getting feedback from others.
Yes, this stage cannot be rushed. The guide emphasizes using a clear, consistent academic style. And this means paying attention to things like tone, sentence structure, and the appropriate use of academic jargon.
Right, jargon. Use precise terms where needed, but don't overdo it. Avoid overly complex language that just obscures your meaning.
Exactly. Clarity is king. And that feedback step is just huge. Academic Practices specifically mentions getting feedback from academic peers who are familiar with your topic.
Yeah, why them specifically?
Well, they note that their insights are particularly valuable. Someone immersed in the topic can tell you if you've missed a key paper, maybe if your interpretation seems a bit off base given the nuances of the field, or just if your argument isn't landing clearly.
Makes sense. They know the context.
Right. Feedback isn't just about catching typos, though that's important too. It's about refining your synthesis and ensuring your contribution is sound and effectively communicated. Reviewing for grammar, flow, overall coherence after incorporating feedback is crucial before that final step.
And that final, very practical step the guide mentions. Carefully following the submission guidelines for the specific journal you plan to submit to.
Oh, don't skip this.
It seems minor, but it's so critical, isn't it? Requirements for formatting, word count, reference style, figure placement. They vary hugely between journals.
Hugely. And not following them is such an easy way to get desk rejected before anyone even reads your actual content. A real shame if that happens.
Definitely an overlooked but absolutely necessary detail. Attention to detail matters right up to the very end.
It really does.
So it's just revisiting our journey through this guide from Academic Practices. We've covered the core process, haven't we? Identifying the gap.
Step 1.
Choosing the right type of review to address it.
A crucial step 2.
Strategically finding and selecting your sources, balancing new and old.
The detective work.
Organizing your material with a clear structure. Intro, lit review, discussion, conclusion.
Building the framework.
And finally, crafting the actual writing through critical analysis and synthesis, and then refining it all through feedback and careful editing.
Phew, it really reinforces the idea that a review article is a significant intellectual undertaking. It's not just a summary.
Not at all.
It's a scholarly contribution that requires careful planning, rigorous searching, critical interpretation of existing knowledge, engagement with academic debates, and of course, clear communication. It's fundamentally about adding value through synthesis and analysis.
So what does this all mean for you listening? This guide from Academic Practices and hopefully our deep dive into it provides you with a concrete roadmap. It helps demystify the process, maybe makes it feel less daunting, and gives you actionable steps to confidently approach writing a review article. Doesn't matter if you're aiming for a comprehensive systematic synthesis, or a broad narrative overview, or maybe that really challenging critical analysis that pushes boundaries, or even just mapping a field visually.
It offers that essential framework to transform what can feel like a messy collection of individual studies into a coherent, insightful, and genuinely valuable academic contribution. Something that can really help others navigate the literature and build upon what's already known.
Absolutely. Okay, so to leave you with something to maybe mull over, think about that concept we touched on, critical analysis and conceptual innovation, particularly in the context of the critical review, a point highlighted by Academic Practices.
Yeah, that's an interesting one.
It's fascinating because you're working only with existing material, right? You're reviewing what others have already published. But somehow, through that act of synthesizing, interpreting, and critically analyzing that body of work, you can actually arrive at genuinely new ideas, maybe new hypotheses or new conceptual models that weren't explicitly stated in any single source you read. How does that deep process of synthesis itself become a catalyst for original thought? Something to ponder.